And the question is very simple. Who is Sarah Mercer and why does your work matter?
I don't know how simple that question is. Who is Sarah Mercer? Why does my work matter? I suppose because it matters to me, and it has always mattered to me because it's about people. And one of the joys of being a teacher is that you get to interact with people daily, that you can help them to become the best version of themselves, and you can give them confidence, you can make them feel safe, you can form relationships with them. It's just an utter privilege. But all of that for me has always been about people. And the workplace that I'm in doesn't always appreciate that. So in Austria, there's a very narrow view of what language teaching at university should be about. And it's very much about methodological decisions, about
Oh,
choosing what method and how you teach grammar and how you teach integrated skills and those kind of things. You can have the best course book in the world, you can have the best methodology in the world, but if you've not connected with your learners, you're going to have a hell of a job to engage them and to connect with them and to get them to work with you. One of the problems I do feel is that if you're talking about generic things like, and I mean generic things like well-being or engagement or motivation, these things are not always just about issues in the language classroom. But academic disciplines have had to, if you like, pee on their lamppost to mark their territory. And there's been a lot of emphasis about what is unique about language teaching, what is different about language teaching, why is it different to general education. Now, sometimes that is a highly pertinent and highly relevant perspective, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes some of the commonalities between a maths teacher and an English teacher are stronger than the differences are. So the good language learner studies, of course, were decontextualized. It was this idea that if you knew what a good language learner did, you just had to transfer it. So, it was conceptually flawed, but it wasn't totally flawed. Looking at what good language learners does gives you some idea of how they approach their learning. What are they finding effective? It doesn't mean you can do a one-to-one transfer. And some of that interpretation was indeed flawed, but I think there was an enormous amount of value in knowing how to learn. And I don't know about your context, but how many textbooks, how many schools, how many universities teach their learners how to learn?
very,
We just
very
assume that
little.
people know how
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about knowing what resources are available. That's a very different set of things. They know more resources than I do. They've got more access to extramural English than I will ever have. I learned a whole new thing today that my students taught me today about Twitch. I've never heard of Twitch, didn't even know what it was. So they are going to be teaching me stuff, not the other way around. But when it comes to how you approach learning and what strategies you can have and developing a sense of agency and empowering them to know their own boundaries and know where they can explore and know how to self-regulate, that's invaluable. And I think the students at the moment need it desperately.
Oh,
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
all right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. And in today's episode, we have a very, very special guest, someone that has been on our radar for quite a long time. And very recently, after a few exchanges of emails and some, difficulties with time zones, we finally have her on the show. So, ladies and gentlemen, a big welcome to Sarah Mercer here on the show with us. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Leo, Andrew, thank you so much for inviting me. I apologize for the chaos that I caused in arranging an appointment and a time, but it's lovely to be here, and thank you for your patience with me. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to talk with you.
Great to have you.
Sarah, I thought we would start from a question that was left by one of our guests, and eventually we just usually use this question to kind of get the ball rolling with the conversation here. And the question is very simple. Who is Sarah Mercer and why does your work matter?
I don't know how simple that question is. Who is Sarah Mercer? Gosh, I don't even know. I'm not even sure that I can answer that. So I'm just going to leave that for a moment. Why does my work matter? I suppose because it matters to me, and it has always mattered to me because it's about people. And one of the joys of being a teacher is that you get to interact with people daily, that you can help them to become the best version of themselves, and you can give them confidence, you can make them feel safe, you can form relationships with them. It's just an utter privilege. But all of that for me has always been about people. Well, it hasn't always been. That was something that I grew into through my own work as a language teacher primarily. And so I have always felt, and the workplace that I'm in doesn't always appreciate that. So in Austria, there's a very narrow view of what language teaching at university should be about. And it's very much about methodological decisions, about
Oh,
choosing what method and how you teach grammar and how you teach integrated skills and those kind of things, which is a big part of what we do as language teachers. But the big part for me has always been that human side, that human connection, the understanding the learners as people, trying to build a relationship with them. And that, I think that has always been sort of important to what I do. And that has basically been where all my work has gone. And we'll perhaps talk in a minute about how I went on that path. And so I've always believed that that's the foundation of everything. You can have the best course book in the world, you can have the best methodology in the world, but if you've not connected with your learners, you're going to have a hell of a job to engage them and to connect with them and to get them to work with you. And so I've always felt that the psychology of language learning, and obviously more recently teaching, is just such a fundamental part of what we do. And I know that not everybody feels or has felt that that is part of the field of SLA. We can talk about SLA as a separate discussion, but also particularly perhaps in the environment that I'm in, that's not seen as language teaching methodology. It's seen as, well, now that opens a whole other line of discussion. It's sometimes seen as being too generic.
huh. Why is
Now,
that?
do I really want to open this can of worms so early in the conversation? Yeah, what the hell, let's go for it. So one of the problems I do feel is that if you're talking about generic things like, and I mean generic things like well-being or engagement or motivation, these things are not always just about issues in the language classroom. But academic disciplines have had to, if you like, pee on their lamppost to mark their territory. And there's been a lot of emphasis about what is unique about language teaching, what is different about language teaching, why is it different to general education. Now, sometimes that is a highly pertinent and highly relevant perspective, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes some of the commonalities between a maths teacher and an English teacher are stronger than the differences are. And this has been a problem, particularly with some of the wellbeing work that we found, is that journals have said, even though the whole work has been in relation to language teachers, a lot of the findings turned out to be generic, particularly in Austria, where issues of linguistics insecurity are very low. They've got very high levels of language proficiency here. So the findings really were saying these are things that are generic to all teachers. All teachers are facing these kind of problems. And the gatekeeping system of the journals and the way journals are constructed was that, we can't publish this. There's nothing specific about language teaching in it.
Right.
Well, no. But does that mean it's suddenly not relevant to language teaching because it doesn't have a language teaching specific element, although the population is purely about language teachers? So that's been quite an interesting thing for me to have to battle out a little bit, and also to establish that I understand why the field and journals and grant providers and so on like neat disciplines and tight disciplinary boundaries, but particularly for this kind of work, it doesn't always fall that neatly.
Interesting. Is that
Sorry, I took us down a really bizarre
no?
path
I
straight
like
away.
that
I'm sorry that.
because it seems to me that this is how you kind of like found your niche in a way. You were trying to perhaps because you. How did you solve that problem? Because that you said you
Solved
haven't.
it. No, I constantly butt up against it, and that's why I go on a rant on it within 2 minutes of talking to you, because I'm still butting up against this problem. So when right at the very beginning, shall we go back to the beginning? That would have been a good place to start. My MA came out of teaching. I got really interested in strategy teaching. This was obviously the 90s, and it was a thing. So I got interested in teaching strategies, did this experiential approach to strategy training, was trying to look at the benefits for the learner. And what came out of that study for me was that the benefits weren't really in terms of linguistic gains. What they were gaining were non-linguistic things. They were gaining agency. They were gaining confidence. They were gaining metacognitive knowledge about learning and their own learning and their own self-regulatory strategies and so on. And so that's what started it, is that I realized that sometimes what leads to effective and successful learning isn't always a direct path from the teaching to the language gains, but there is this whole mediating sphere of psychology and what goes on in the learner's mind and how agentic they feel, how confident they feel, how willing to take risks they are, and so on. And that's what started me on that path. And I somehow carried on that way and have never kind of stopped. And I'm glad. I have enjoyed it and I love it. And I'm just there's never a shortage of things I want to know or learn. And it's one of those, the more you learn, the more you know what you don't know. And I just feel like there's so much I don't know. I don't even know where to begin. But it's a wonderful field to work in.
It's funny you mentioned this whole idea of learner strategy, the benefits for the learner, agency, self-efficacy. And you're right. This is like goes back to the 90s, and I remember lessons from good language learners being like one of the seminal books back in the day. But my question then is, do you think that for some reason now, in this new era with social media, with this attention economy, don't you think, because currently I think we all teach here, and one of the things I've noticed is I feel like my learners have lost the ability to learn properly, to have agency over the development, to understand strategies that would help them become better language learners or better learners in general. And I noticed that textbooks also don't have that as much. There seems to be, I think the pendulum has swung in a different direction where the focus now is more on social justice, inclusivity, and all these things at the expense of these other also important things. So my question to you then is, isn't it time that perhaps we spend more time talking about the psychology of learning? What happens with the learner as they are being taught a lesson? Because as you said, a lot of these things are not just linguistic, but they're also psychological, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you're talking to the converted here. So I think, so the good language learner studies, of course, were decontextualized. It was this idea that if you knew what a good language learner did, you just had to transfer it. So, it was conceptually flawed, but it wasn't totally flawed. Looking at what good language learners does gives you some idea of how they approach their learning. What are they finding effective? It doesn't mean you can do a one-to-one transfer. And some of that interpretation was indeed flawed, but I think there was an enormous amount of value in knowing how to learn. And I don't know about your context, but how many textbooks, how many schools, how many universities teach their learners how to learn? We just assume that people know how to do it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about knowing what resources are available. That's a very different set of things. They know more resources than I do. They've got more access to extramural English than I will ever have. I learned a whole new thing today that my students taught me today about Twitch. I've never heard of Twitch, didn't even know what it was. So they are going to be teaching me stuff, not the other way around. But when it comes to how you approach learning and what strategies you can have and developing a sense of agency and empowering them to know their own boundaries and know where they can explore and know how to self-regulate, that's invaluable. And again, you come back to things. Some of that will be specific to language learning, and some of it is generic about how we learn. And I think I'm very sorry that we have lost that focus, and very much wish that we could return a little bit to that. And I think the students at the moment need it desperately.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't think anybody teaches them at any point how that they should learn. I think we assume, particularly maybe even with English, I think we assume that because the resources and access to English is there, that they know how to learn. And those are two very different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at the risk of oversimplifying it, how do people learn? Or you seem to mention a divergence there from resources available that help people learn versus the actual process of learning to learn. And you mentioned a couple of things there. Maybe those are your tenets in terms of agency and autonomy and those kinds of things. It's an unfair question because the answer is not simple. But what are one or two things that you would put on that, Mount Rushmore, I guess, of learning to learn?
I think self-regulation is a big thing. And I think you talked a little bit earlier, you mentioned the word attention, you talked about being able to manage distractions, being able to focus for longer periods of time, being able to self-regulate, I think is more important than it has ever been. I think this idea that you set goals and you can assess your progress and make sure that you're making progress to them and manage distractions and know what your triggers are and know how you manage that. I think all that kind of regulated. Geez, we need it. Never mind.
I was just going to say that adults don't have that. Yeah.
I don't have it. Never. Don't get me here as holier than thou. So I think all of this sort of ways of managing our attention. You talked about the attention economy, understanding that attention is a valuable resource. What you give it to creates your reality. So there's a lot to be said for understanding the fact that your attention is a valuable resource to you, and what you give it to matters to the quality of life that you lead. And that is in terms of social media and the kind of news and the kind of reporting and the kind of people that you choose to engage with. But that's also very much in terms of, if you want to learn, you are going to have to invest, if we're going to use that metaphor of economy, some of your attention in that process. And how would it be wise to invest it? In what ways would it make sense? Where would be a sensible use of your attention? So I think I think we need that, never mind the learners.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that's a huge part of managing your learning nowadays in a very, very competitive environment where there's something pulling on your attention all the time.
Is that an argument for, I'm wondering, just thinking out loud, is that an argument for in-person learning? Because I'm just thinking about myself. I'm teaching a class in person for the first time now in 4 years since the pandemic happened. And I was joking with Leo, but I wasn't joking, it was real. When I'm teaching online, talking about like divergence and distractions and attention, I've got like 19 screens open. I'm doing a whole bunch of different things. Breakout rooms are happening and I'm planning the next task. Even sitting here talking to you right now, I've got all the recordings going on. I'm taking notes over here. Like, the online stuff is just, I think, naturally distracting, or you just open yourself up to all of these things, whereas in person maybe it's not. Is this an argument for in-person learning just from that psychology perspective?
I intuitively want to say yes, but I'm wary in that I don't know that that's a justified yes. But I think there are so many other benefits to being in person, particularly in relation to language learning. And I do think that a core part of being a language learner and a language user is also developing interpersonal competences. Language is about communication. Whatever language it is that we're learning, it's about communication and communicating with other people. That's the foundation of learning a language, whatever language that might be. And a core part of that is not tied to any specific cultures or target cultures or is about interpersonal competences. And we can develop those in the language classroom as part of working together. And I think there's a lot of benefit for language teaching when students learn to communicate with each other in diverse settings within the classroom in ways that just don't happen online. No matter how brilliant your breakout room management and how funky you have your classes, sitting in person or having people stood up or having them move around the room or have them form different groups, that in-person form of communication is very qualitatively different. And I think as part of teaching the language, we can be teaching these interpersonal skills at the same time. In the good old days, it was communicative competence. But of course, that became tied up also with notions of culture at the time and so on. And I think I would take it back a step from there and say communicative competence is still a core part of it, but maybe it is non-culture specific. It's about interpersonal competence. Right. It's about being able to communicate with other people, learning to listen, having empathy, being able to imagine how your communication is affecting them and how they feel about your communication, and being able to collaborate and work together as a group. I think all of those are core parts of communication. And so maybe some of these good old-fashioned communication studies have a lot to teach us. That so it's not just about language, it's about communication and being together as people.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I was teaching a class just today. And even though the students were in class, and we're going to talk about engagement, and I felt like they were engaged, I was still somehow competing with their phones because they're always going to be checking their phones.
Yes.
Which brings me to the question of attention. And perhaps we can, before we jump into engagement, I remember you talking, I think it was one of your, I don't know if it was your IATEFL talk or if it was another talk, where you were talking about the shrinking of attention spans and all the challenges that Andrew just mentioned right now, posed by all these digital distractions that we have. From a perhaps practical perspective, Sarah, how should teachers adapt their teaching methodologies, their teaching strategies to somewhat mitigate the impact of these issues? And the example that I'm thinking of is this generation of learners, they need to be constantly engaged, on task, and as you said, communicating. the moment the teacher spends, and I'm looking at methodology here, and I'm thinking about a PPP framework, where the teacher spends 20 minutes presenting language, the students are lost. So PPP doesn't work with this younger generation, in my humble opinion. So with the shrinking attention spans and all these challenges, what, in your opinion, as someone who is very well versed in this and researched this, what are some strategies that teachers can adapt or use in their teaching to address these things more effectively?
Well, there's two things I'll say if I don't lose my track. So the first one is we can't compete with the phone. So that's a lost battle. You can't, you're never, there is a reason why this is called an addiction. And you as an individual teacher can't compete with that. So I think some of the conversation we've just had about developing self-regulation, about managing your attention, about being very explicit with learners about how this can be damaging and helpful. Now, at different age groups, that conversation is going to be more difficult, but I think there is a place to make this conversation explicit. We don't have to be doing it implicitly all the time. You know, this was the old debate about strategies. Can we have do they have to be implicit or explicit? And I think when we're talking about attention, we're talking about self-regulatory strategies, managing attention, managing distractions, certainly as you get older and more mature, I think learners are capable of having very explicit conversations about that. Now, going back to the sort of other practical side of that, although I think that's quite a practical approach with some level of learners that you can have, but I think another very practical approach is I think we just have to be guided by in what way can we make these activities more active? Everything. If we're going to be doing grammar, right, let's start with a deductive approach. Let's get them to work out what is the grammar. You know, these are things that exist. These are not things that, these are approaches that already exist. They're certainly not created by me and I have no input on those. But if we know that the key is learners need to be active, and like you say, Leo, PPP, giving them some forward frontal input, even with my students at university, 5 minutes, if I'm lucky, they'll give me, and then they're done with me, and then I've used up my time. So I think anything that gets them active from word go, these fast starts where you get them straight in, okay, quick speedy activity to begin the lesson while I'm getting stuff sorted. Because if I'm getting stuff sorted, they're on the phone, it's gone. So literally the minute you go, you come in and you say, okay, last lesson I'm making stuff up now, I'm talking rubbish, but last lesson we talked about, I don't know what's in the course books that I've been looking at recently.
Writing an email to a professor.
Right, writing an email to a professor. Okay, just jot down 10 pieces as quickly as you can. First group to finish, put their hand up. 10 pieces of advice. What makes a good letter to good email to a professor? Go. And then you go and do something else, and then you come back, and that's enough. And that's a summary of last lesson. But it's at speed, it's at pace, they are doing it, it's student directed. And we have to kind of reframe everything from that lens is how can we do this activity with the same learning outcome, but keeping them as the ones who are active and keeping our input more as facilitative and guidance. If we've got some grammar that we have to teach, some grammar aspect that we wish to focus on, starting with a deductive book, did you work it out? You are the language detective. I'm going to make you a language detective. I'm going to give you some text, and there's a rule in here, and I want you to work it out. So get yourselves in groups. You're in groups of 3. You're a language detective. You see if you can come up with the rule. What is the rule here in the language? And then you give it, and off they go. And then you say, okay, now let's see if you're right. Test it out with each other. Test out everybody's rules. See if it works. So it's just as if it was so easy. It does require us to rethink. It requires us to look at what we're doing. If we've got, let's say the worst, most awful activity, you've got a course book and you've got 10 gap fill activities that you have to do. That you say to the guys, right, we've got 10 gap fill activities to do there. I want you to pick the 6 that you want to do and ignore the other 4. And they still have to read all 10 in order to answer 6. Or that you say, I think these are pretty boring. And don't you? Do you think these are boring? I think these are quite boring. You take these, let's take 5 of them. You choose 5, get the same verb, but make it a much more interesting sentence. So it's not reinventing the wheel. It's not going completely away from what we're already doing. It's just seeing where we can maximize learner autonomy, learner decision-making, where we can maximize their action and bring them into... It's like learner-centered on steroids. How can we really make them be the center of what they do? How can we make them really be the ones who do everything? And you know what? and then we come to the other teacher, well, that's high energy. That's hard work. And so, I'm not under any illusions that that's easy. And you know what? There will be lessons where teachers go in and they open the book and they teach from the book and that's it. And you know what? That's okay too. We can't every lesson be Wonder Woman. That isn't going to work, and it's an express road to burnout. So, and if we have lessons like that, we don't beat ourselves up over it. That's life. And your students are not going to be damaged irreparably just because they've had one crappy lesson from you.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about giving ourselves a bit of a break, knowing that we're working in quite challenging circumstances, and maybe sometimes being realistic about what we can achieve because we're competing with something very difficult. But maybe also looking at what we're doing anyway and seeing, is there a way that we can think about this in a way that's going to animate and activate the learner more, so that the key is that they're in control. I don't know if that's any help at all.
It is. I think what I'm hearing a lot of things here. What I'm hearing is that basically we have to break down teaching into mini lessons, or perhaps even what we call micro teaching. Basically, you're teaching, periods of 5 minutes. So 5 minutes, we're going to work on this. Boom, do it, produce something. And then we spend another 5 minutes working on something. Because as you said, I've noticed that intelligent teaching, and I think this is something that Haiti put in one of his papers, which I think it really guides a lot of the things that I do, is intelligent teaching just takes place when the teachers begin to see learning from the eyes of the students. And everything that you're saying to me, it's like we have to kind of try to otherize a little bit and try to see things from their perspective, from their eyes, and then guide them, of course, to become better language learners, which brings us to another challenge, I would say, which is engagement, which is an area that you have written and researched extensively. You talk a lot about the importance of engagement, but I would like you to provide a definition of engagement just so we can get the ball rolling there. How would you define engagement in an educational setting? And why is it so important for us to engage learners so we can actually see some sort of learning happening?
So I think all the things that we've talked about are engagement. I think for me, that's all about engagement. So the big distinction has always been is how do you make a difference between engagement and motivation? And perhaps this is an interesting story as to understand how I came to this. So as I was teaching and doing workshops with teachers and doing some training, and I kept talking about motivation because, of course, that was part of my heritage and that was what I was interested in. And the learners said, yeah, I can't motivate the learners. It's not really about motivation. And the more I started to understand that really it was about engagement. So engagement is about that learners being, you talked about it earlier, I think it was Andrew said, on task, being that you are invested cognitively, you're thinking about what you're supposed to be doing, you're on task, you're emotionally invested in it, in that you're interested, and you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. And, we do have that distinction between authentic engagement, where you are really doing that, and then also this just going through the motions compliance. Now, on some days, compliance might be the best you can hope for.
Yeah.
And you know what?
That's true.
We'll take what we get. If compliance is what we're going to have today, then okay, that'll do. We're not going to. So for me, engagement was about what was happening in the classroom. It wasn't about, for me, motivation is that kind of background driver, that maybe bigger picture of what language learning means to you, what it represents, what you would like maybe to ultimately achieve to it. It's sort of a bigger driver. But as you said before, your attention can be hijacked. So no matter how motivated you are, I really want to be good at English, I really want to do well in this course. And then I go into class and there's this really interesting debate going on my phone, and then my friend's sending me pictures and you're gone. Yeah. And engagement is, I don't know, this is not my word, somebody talks about it as being the link between the learner and the curriculum, in that what is happening, if the learner does not engage, the learning won't happen. You can't learn without being engaged. That isn't going to happen. And, we have got the issue of implicit learning and natural acquisition in language learning. But the reality is that if you're not going to engage with the language, and I'm not talking now necessarily about conscious learning of rules, I'm talking about actually using the language, working with the language, engaging with the language. If you're not going to do that, it isn't going to happen. You're not going to learn. So I started to understand for me that maybe it was engagement that I was interested in more than the motivation, because engagement feels to me something that is much more in the control of the teacher than motivation is. Motivation is much harder to engender as a teacher, much harder to tap into, much harder to create. Whereas engagement, I have some control over that in how I design my lessons, how I design activities, how I pace my lessons, how I structure them. And so engagement became fascinating to me because it felt like that was what I could do something about in class. And I felt it was the key to understanding how learning was actually then going to happen or not happen.
Interesting.
Okay.
Motivation may be the reason they end up in your class, right, on day one, because they've signed up, they're motivated by something, and then through engagement, am I on the right track? Like through the engagement of the lessons, they stay in that state?
Yeah, I don't think the two are completely separate, obviously. I mean, you know, if you've got some motivation, but I think, you know, if you've got engaging classes, you might actually motivate your learners for the subject. They might have to come, you know, there's billions of teachers worldwide who their kids have to come to their class. They have no choice. They haven't chosen the class. They're stuck in it and day in, day out, and they might not even want to go to school, let alone your class. But if we can engage our learners and if we can help them see a relevance or a purpose to what they're doing, maybe we can awaken some motivation. Not guaranteed, there's no guarantees in anything, but maybe we can do. And vice versa, they might come highly motivated and they don't engage with our classes, they don't engage with us, the learning, it just doesn't click, and then they lose their motivation as well. So I think the two are very closely related. I have just always felt that somehow for me it feels easier to connect to engagement than it does to motivation. Although, if you want learners to engage, I think they have to see the relevance of what they're doing, the purpose, the meaning behind it. And then that does connect, obviously, to your motivation then ultimately.
And this is all related. And I was thinking about this, Sarah and Andrew, you probably remember this. I'm seeing a lot. I'm taking notes here. I'm very engaged in this conversation. So that's a good thing.
I don't know. You might have your phone down there.
I have to be engaged. I'm not complying, or I'm just really engaged. But we had a conversation with Bill Van Patten, and he was talking about the Atlas complex, which is basically this idea that teachers feel that everything is their responsibility. So they assume full responsibility for all that goes on. They have to supply the motivation. They have to supply the insights. They have to provide clear explanations, even at points, even intellectual curiosity, which is a topic that I want to get to. And in exchange, what is the student supplying? Almost nothing. But what we would call a faint imitation of the performance that the teacher wants to witness. So what I'm seeing is engagement is perhaps the way to go for teachers. Teachers should not be thinking, because the question that we often ask, that I'm often asking in workshops, in sessions, teacher training, education, things like that, it's always like, Leo, but how do I motivate my students? How do I motivate my students? I said, I don't motivate my students. And I don't believe in motivate. I can barely motivate myself sometimes, let alone another person. I can't motivate my kids to do things. I try to get them engaged, but I never really thought about it this way. So, and what I'm seeing is that this whole idea of the Atlas complex and supplying motivation, it's not discipline specific. It's just teacher-centered. It's this knowledge-transmitting classroom as the norm. So I think the question that I have for you then, Sarah, would be, what are some of the most common obstacles or impediments that you think teachers face? Not when they're trying to motivate students, but when they're trying to engage them in the classroom. What are some, based on your experience, what have you noticed teachers struggling with when it comes to engaging students in a lesson? And how can they perhaps deal with those challenges?
You know, I think if I had the answers to those questions, Leo, I'd be on the Bahamas now on some beach. No disrespect to you, but I'd probably be just having my feet up and reading a book and drinking a tequila and making my millions. So if I had the answer to that question, I would be a wealthy woman and wouldn't. I think there's a lot of things. I think a lot of the things we've spoken about in terms of technology and things. Remember, kids have got lives too. They've got stuff going on at home. They've got stuff going on. They've got hobbies. They've got fights with their friends. They're living lives too. So as a teacher, you're always competing with that stuff. And when you're a teenager, you've got a lot of stuff going on.
Oh, yeah.
So as a teacher, you're competing not only with the technology and all the stuff that's associated with, but their minds are full of other stuff. Their bodies are chock full of hormones. So there's all that stuff going on. There are people in the class that are a wonderful distraction on all kinds of levels. They've got their own worries about life, about sport, about their family. So all of that is going on. And, sometimes we think that learners just come to our class and they're just there to learn, and but they're whole people too. We talk about the whole child, the whole person. But if you really understand that, that means they've got stuff going on too, and you're competing with that as well. Sometimes they've had bad experiences in the subject you're trying to teach, so they come with a built-in resistance that they are already resistant to your subject for whatever reason. They may come with a built-in resistance to school because they've had bad experiences in schooling before in education. So you're competing with that built-in resistance as well. So these are not things just about language teaching. I mean, in language teaching, you have got things specific to the fear of using the language, the lack of self-expression, the ability to not communicate quite who you are, your personality, your humor, whatever it is. So you've got all those issues in self-portrayal, self-expression, the faith-threatening nature of using a foreign language, and that limited form of being able to convey who you are. All of that specific to language teaching. But you've got all the stuff in education generally going on that is also a distraction. So there's a lot of things that are competing, and that's why a teacher's job is so difficult. And that's why, going back to what you said earlier, teachers must never feel it's all in their control. There is so much out of our control. And that's why, if we're going to talk later about burnout and well-being, you have to know the limits of your control, what you can influence, and be realistic, and don't beat yourself up about not being able to reach every child, every lesson. That's unrealistic, and it's okay sometimes to have lessons where you come out and say, not my best day. Okay, well, have another one tomorrow.
I like it. I don't know what the opposite of devil's advocate would be. Angels something or other, I don't know. But as you're describing the distractions that can exist in a classroom or just in a learning environment, distracted by other people in the class, all of these things, that just strikes me as, you're describing it as an obstacle, because that's the question that Leo asked you, but that's also an opportunity, right? Because that's real life. Real life has distractions. And you, at the beginning of the show, you were talking about building agency, autonomy, and having learners choose to learn outside the class. But it made me think, is it an active choice? Or if we make it an active choice, it can become a chore, right? Versus something that's just happens organically. And by having those distractions in the classroom, maybe that's actually mimicking the real world, and it's kind of an opportunity as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's life, isn't it? Nothing is straightforward, and nothing is perfect, and people will sometimes people don't want choice. And this has been the whole discussion in the autonomy literature. If you prescribe choice and you say you have to choose, you might not want to choose for me. Just tell me, And if I go to a restaurant and there's too many choices, I don't know. Just tell me what I'm eating. I don't, I can't have too many choices. So, the paradox of choice, I'm sure you're familiar with. So, I think sometimes, if I go back to the very beginning of my teacher training and my education as a teacher, 101 teaching was start where your learners are, not where you think they should be, and work with what you've got, not what you wish you had. And that was kind of 101 teacher training, and it's still something that I come back to on all kinds of levels. That's useful advice to remind me of, that I need to come back to, is I've got my own agenda when I go in. And you talked earlier, Leo, about this Atlas complex, and there's this whole notion of reverse engineering. I think that's what we call it, isn't it? When you do lesson planning, where you decide what you want your learning outcomes to be, and you reverse engineer, you design everything to create that outcome. And that's what teaching is about, is designing what you would like to happen, and then you design your lesson plan to achieve those outcomes. But you have to be responsive to what's there, and you can go in with the brilliant lesson plan, and if they're just not in that space today, then you're going to have to think on your feet. And that, if we get later in this conversation to AI, that is the craft of a good teacher. Because a good teacher is somebody who goes in, doesn't battle ahead blindly with their lesson plan, but looks at what's going on, reads the room, reads the people, reads what's happening, tries an activity, sees, this isn't, let's just rethink this completely. We're going to do something different today. Yeah. And it's that, I think it was Neil Selwyn, he calls it the jazz, the improvisation, and the art of teaching. And it is that, as you say, Andrew, that responsiveness to what is there, what you're working with, your learners at the space they are at that moment in time, and not seeing everything as a problem, but seeing it as, okay, this is what we've got, let's work with it. What's the opportunities here? What's the best that we can do about that? And I don't, for a moment, I'm not stood here saying that any of that is easy, not at all.
I was just going to say, and that's
So
exhausting. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's
Just thinking
exhausting
about it
and
and
it's
talking about it.
difficult. Yeah, and it's a lot to think of, and it's a lot to respond to, and that's what people who are not involved in education don't understand. And that is why when you come back from 4 hours of teaching, you're knackered, because 4 hours of teaching is this thinking on your feet and responding and dealing with everybody's issues, and you don't switch off. You are engaged because you're thinking always about making these decisions and planning and responding.
If you are that kind of educator, because I have worked with people who they just have their agenda, they have their plan, and that's all they do. They hop on the silly bus, and that it's horse track English all the way. I need to finish this. As opposed to, and I think that's where, because we're talking about teaching now, and I think we've come out of engagement, but I want to jump into the teaching part now, because I think that's what as you said, Sarah, that's the essence of intelligent teaching. And you spoke about pedagogical caring, the importance of showing students that their learning matters to the teacher. And I don't know if you or a lot of people are familiar with this, but John Hatie has written extensively about that, where he basically talks about, I think it was, they called the Measures of Effective Teaching, which is also a project by the Gates Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where they wrote, I think, the 7 C's of effective teaching. And one of them was care.
Yeah.
And what I also really like about that is that it's all written from the student's perspective, Andrew. So it's not like I do this. It's always my teacher feel that he or she really cares about me. And one of them is control.
Awesome.
Our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. So I've been thinking about using these 7 C's in the future when teaching classes. But the question that I have for you is pedagogical caring, importance of showing students that their learning matters to the teacher. I think I'm curious as to how teachers can demonstrate this in both a genuine and impactful way.
So I think my understanding of this, and I may be wrong and other people may have a different understanding of this, my understanding of pedagogical caring is that it's not only showing that you care about the individual, and those are little things, making sure you know their names, making sure you know how to pronounce their names, so really knowing the person as an individual, making time for these little micro conversations where you chat in the hallway and you say, hey, I heard about your baseball team, that's great, I'm so pleased that they won, and what did you want? Or, these little things. Those matter enormously because it means that the student has been seen, that the teacher knows who they are, and they know something about them. And one of the things that I've often said was a lesson that I got from a wonderful teacher here in Austria who I admire greatly, just a brilliant, brilliant teacher, mildly terrifying. She's really strict and she was quite firm. But the students loved her and she had great humor and great spunk. And one of the things I learned from her is she made notes about her learners. It's not cheating to have a cheat sheet at home that says this person, that football team, this person, that. It shows that you care. You've taken the trouble to make some notes. Maybe you've got their photograph, whatever it is you've got at home. And that's so that when you next see them again, you go, oh, let me remember. Oh, that's what it was. And you do it. And that's very deliberate. And it's meant to look natural. And it's meant to look authentic and natural, but of course it's effortful. This teacher that I'm talking about, she had a list of people's names and she had a list of notes about them. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that as cheating. I see that as a sign that you care enough to go to that kind of trouble to remember who your learners are and find out about them. So there's that kind of thing about knowing about the person and finding ways to connect with them as an individual, because also in terms of discipline, kids are less likely to play up, and this is a known fact, if you feel that you are seen and known by your teacher. And if you form a relationship to your teacher, there's no guarantees, but you're less likely to act out. But the other thing from my understanding of pedagogical carings, is things like the kind of feedback you give, the time you take for feedback, the way that you involve them in discussions, the way that you democratize your decision making, the conversations you have that show respect to your learners, respect being a two-way street. So we've talked about some of these autonomies. Say, guys, we've got 2 units that we have to still do. The first one is on, I don't know, the environment. The second one is on, I don't know, jobs. Which one would you like us to do first? Let's have a quick vote on this. Now, these are just ways that you show that you're letting them be involved in decision making. You set an activity and you say, okay, we need to do this activity. What do you think? Do we need 10 minutes or 15 minutes? How many people think 10? How many 15? Okay, let's go for the 15 minutes then. So these are ways that you show that you care, in that you show that you give them respect, that you involve them in decision making. The care of your worksheets. We had a lovely one of my student teachers came back from one of her teaching practical experiences, and she came back and she showed me this worksheet that one of her supposedly mentor teachers had used, and it was a classic right out of the 1980s typewriter worksheet. You remember those where they were not photocopied on a machine, but photocopied by hand, and this teacher's still using that 1980s handout. Bless their cotton socks. So that doesn't communicate to your learners that you care. But, making a sheet, trying to find a pretty graphic that you put on it, trying to just make the font nice, make it look nice if you're going to create a handout. Those are things that show that you care about their learning. When you give them feedback, but this is something that I think good teachers do anyway, formative feedback, constructive feedback, helping learners know how to get better. So it's not just this is what you've done and this is what you've done wrong. It's like, this is what you've done. This is what I think we can do that's going to help you to get better. This is what I think we need to be working on to help you improve. So I think that the way that we show that we care about our learners is, yes, that we know them as individuals and make an effort to do that, but also that we show through the way that we teach that we respect them and we want them to learn and that we want the best for them. And I think we can communicate that in all kinds of ways in our teaching.
Common sense would suggest that a teacher doing that would increase classroom engagement, right? But what does the research show? Like, how significantly, if there were studies, I'm sure there were, versus a teacher doing that, a teacher doing not that, what differences are, how stark were the differences in engagement?
I don't know. I don't know the study, but I can imagine. So the whole of our understanding was that the understanding of engagement that Zoltan and I developed is, we talked about like a 3-stage model, that you have what we call a willingness to engage. And if you create that kind of relational climate, and if you create those foundations of quality interpersonal relationships between you and the students, but also among the students, you've got the best conditions for engagement to happen. No guarantees yet, but that's the fertile ground, if you like, for what we call a willingness to engage. And then the next thing is designing the actual activities and tasks to trigger engagement and sustain engagement. So that's sort of 3, if you, as you say, Andrew, work on these relationships and you try to create this kind of basis and this foundation, that's the best place for engagement to happen. And then on that, you can build your activities and design and how you go about your teaching and the way you do it.
This is the first time I hear the term willingness to engage. I had seen willingness to communicate, but I actually just found a study here by Kim called "Willingness to Engage: The Importance of What Learners Bring to Pair Work." So I'm definitely going to be reading that. What is this willingness to engage then, Sarah? Do you have perhaps a definition for that?
I do officially in an article that I wrote with a colleague of mine, but I actually wouldn't be able to tell you it like the definition in that way.
Okay.
But for me, I am in the right state of mind and degree of comfort and sense of agency that I'm willing to engage. So I'm coming with rather than, we talked earlier about some learners have had bad experiences, so they're resistant to learning and they come with like a mental block. This is a mental openness, if you like, that you say, I'm comfortable, I feel agentic, I feel safe, I feel that I am willing, I'm happy to engage. And then whether you actually get them to engage or not is a different issue. But you've created those conditions where you've got a good starting point. They're actually in that frame of mind where they say, I'm open to learning, I'm open to engaging, I'm feeling comfortable, I feel safe, and I'm willing to engage.
I actually think it's a very important variable now that we're talking about it, especially because I know we'll do a lot of pair work and group work, and perhaps a learner's willingness to engage with another partner, another colleague in pair work will definitely influence the nature of that pair work, and their willingness is going to be influenced by the perceived difficulty of whatever the activity. So if you are with a partner who is willing to engage, then that task is going to be fun and you are both going to enjoy it. But if the partner is not willing to engage, then you kind of like perhaps will perceive that task differently, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And then because all of these
interesting.
things are socially, and you know,
Yeah.
we might come, in fact, I'm sure we'll come to that later, is that when we talk about psychology, we're very focused on individuals and the relational qualities, but there's also a strong social element to that as well. And the setup of things in terms not just of the relationships and the power dynamics and so on, but also the context in which that all takes place and the expectations. And also I think this temporality of psychology, that you bring all your baggage with you. And you've got all these things that affect you. You don't come in without all that, and you've got your own ambitions and anticipation of the future. So I think this notion of temporality is also something that allows us to understand people's pasts and also their expectations for the future and how that impacts on their willingness in the present, maybe.
Since we're talking about definitions, my wheels are turning now. They're spinning, because you contrasted willingness to engage with compliance. So then what is the definition of compliance? And is that compliance with the teacher? Is it also compliance in a group setting with other students as well?
Yeah, so compliance is this idea that you do what you know you're supposed to do because you're supposed to do it. And I'm not sure that's always about, maybe I'm slightly naive. Sometimes I think compliance is all I'm going to get. I'll go with that. That's fine. Compliance is just fine for now. So I think there is this idea that for sustained learning over time, compliance is not going to lead to deep long-term learning in the same way that if it's an authentic engagement that you're going to do that. But compliance might be the best you're going to get at some moment in time. Also, I think we did some research on fake engagement.
Oh.
So this was a deeply humbling experience, let me tell you, because it was with my learners. So this is talk about deeply humbling. So we researched with our learners when they basically faked it, when they pretended in class that they were engaged, but actually they were not. And what were they doing and why were they doing it? It was fascinating. It was ridiculously fascinating. It was mildly depressing as well, but it was fascinating. So, of course, all learners do it. And there's not one single person listening to this podcast who hasn't been at a talk and been sat there going, and their mind is completely somewhere else. And we've all done it. So, so the reason this resonates is everybody hears it and goes, oh, yeah, I've done that. So the learners were very frank about the fact that, sometimes they nodded and then they would ask an occasional question because they were pretending to be interested. And they faked it, and they faked it very deliberately. But for me, perhaps the most interesting part of this is they faked it because they had respect for the teacher. If they didn't care about the teacher, if the teacher had, irritated them, they didn't even bother to fake it because they didn't care enough about their relationship to the teacher to hide it. Now, that could be culture specific in the Austria. If they don't care, if they don't like you, and they're going to show you that they don't like you. So that could be very culturally specific. I'm sure in some cultures, politeness markers will be way higher than they are here, so that would kick in. But it was interesting to understand that the motivations behind faking engagement are sometimes because they don't want to be disrespectful, but they acknowledge themselves that at that moment in time, they can't engage. They are somewhere else for whatever reason. And very often it was they had other stuff going on. And so the best they could do was just try and keep track of stuff that was going on, and they faked their engagement. And so that's like beyond compliance. That's not even compliance. We're not even at compliance at that stage. And you know what? That's life, and that's going to happen. And I don't know a single teacher who that won't have happened to, possibly every single day. And I don't know a single person. Yeah, Leo's doing it to me now. So
No, I'm just thinking about this whole fake engagement, and there's so much I want to ask and explore. Yeah.
Even in the class, right? I mean, let's be honest. Like as teachers, like students are making a presentation or whatever, and some of them are awesome, and some of them are less than awesome. And you're doing the head bob, and oh yeah, great, good stuff, very good. Like I think that's really interesting. We all do it, right?
I didn't know it was a thing. Fake engagement. That's great. But again, fake engagement, real engagement, compliance. As long as that they're doing the work, that's all that matters. Because at least they will see some sort of progress. I wanted to shift gears here and talk a little bit more about teacher well-being, because we've been talking about teachers, and I know you have written a book on teacher well-being. And I don't think a lot of people, I have to be very honest with you, and I'm going to say this live on the podcast because I have skin in the game. At first, when I first hear about the term teacher well-being, I was very skeptical. I was like, this is some BS. This is some kumbaya type of thing. I'm like, who needs teacher well-being? You just go into the classroom, do your thing, But eventually I had burnout. I had 3 burnouts in a year.
Oh my.
And then also because the people that I had been following who were talking about teaching well-being, they were talking about self-care, drinking a glass of wine. I don't drink alcohol, so I'm like, this doesn't apply to me. So again, it goes back to that criticism where people were talking about teacher well-being from a very superficial, very surface level perspective. So perhaps you, as someone who's an expert in the subject, you could tell us more about well-being. So how do you define well-being in the context of English language teaching? And more importantly, because I have dealt with this, why is it important? Why is it crucial for us to move beyond the simplistic understandings that many people seem to have on that topic?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So there's a lot that I'd like to open in another sort of thread about this, is that there's a whole conversation we can have about being a woman and researching female topics like emotions and well-being and empathy and compassion. So I could literally open a whole podcast just on that conversation about my experiences of being a woman researching supposedly female topics. And I expect that the way I have been engaged with would be different if I had been a man. That's quite a big supposition, but I'm just going to leave that and deposit that there for maybe a different
I think it makes a lot of sense, Sarah. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it does. I think it does.
You might not drink wine, but I might later on the basis of that. So let me tell you how I started with well-being, and then you'll understand a bit of my background about how I came to this. So all my research originally was about the learner. Mm-hmm. And I became interested in complexity theory. And I don't know how familiar you are with complexity theory, but it's about understanding the ecology of the classroom, understanding the relationships in the classroom. And I kept coming back and saying, God, everything's about the teacher. I mean, the teacher is the center of everything. The teacher is related to every learner in the class. So everything centers around the teacher. So I went to the literature to say, what do we know about teachers and as individuals, as a psychologists? And there was stuff about teacher cognition, so decision-making processes. There was some stuff about teacher identity, and that was primarily often to do with the transition. But there was nothing really about teachers as people, as what their motivations were, what their emotions were, how they were experiencing their teaching, what they were feeling while they were teaching. Nothing. And it struck me as odd. And I still think this is a massive lacuna, a massive hole in our field. And there are lots of reasons why the teacher as a person has been neglected, but it's a huge mistake. And we're just starting to maybe redress the balance a little bit. So that's how I came to well-being, and that's how I came to start looking at teachers as people living their lives in the classroom, talking to that. And so it was teachers who then, through our conversations, guided me to well-being as a topic. And in that way, I think it's just such a real topic for so many teachers. If you look at the kind of teaching we've been talking about today, it's extremely demanding of people. And if you take it seriously, and if you're a committed and dedicated educator, it puts you at such risk because you are so invested in what you do. And on the one hand, you get, and that's the double-edged sword of being an educator. You get an enormous amount back from what you do. It's one of the most rewarding jobs there is. But because we care so much, we can invest to the extent we don't know when to stop ourselves. And it's hard to set boundaries, and it's hard to create the kind of distance that we need. And also, a lot is expected of teachers, in ways that I think is unreasonable. And we'll come to that in a moment. Now, my history, of course, was all in psychology. And everything that I had done in my career up to that point had been in psychology. So my first sort of foray into this, you start looking and you find the literature and you start reading. And of course, psychology as a discipline has not been very social. That isn't the nature of psychology as a field
Right.
and a discipline. And that, again, could be probably a whole other podcast about understanding psychology as a discipline and also the misunderstandings of psychology in our field. But, let's not get too distracted. So psychology by nature has focused on the individual, and that's why some of this self-care stuff comes from that perspective, in that it has been a focus on the individual and individual responsibility and individual psychology. And there is a branch of psychology, of social psychology, but that is, one branch of the whole field. And so that's part of the heritage, in that it comes from a field of psychology. It wasn't originally a social concept, it was a psychological concept. And it was originally, the sort of primary focus has been on understanding the relative emotional balance of your life. So the original subjective well-being construct was about your relative experience of positive to negative emotions. So this was never about not having negative emotions. That, as you would just say earlier, is BS. There is no such thing. Everybody has positive and negative emotions. That's life. But the statement was that well-being was about having, relatively speaking, more of the positive emotions than the negative. But it didn't deny that they exist. It was just the relative balance. And it was about a sense of satisfaction with one's life and feeling satisfied with how things were going. So that was the original sort of psychological construct. And then some of the more eudaimonic views of well-being looked more at sort of self-actualization, took a move, also incorporated things like physical health and social relationships. So it started to become a little bit more social. And that's kind of where we also started, because I intuitively, from my background in complexity theory, knew of the importance of the relationship, so knew that that would be part of it. And the minute you start to research this topic seriously, and we started the research about, my team and I really started in all earnest with, I think it was 2016, looking at CLIL teacher wellbeing. That's a whole other story. So, and once you start researching it, you can no longer see it as a psychological construct. Almost immediately, you have to recognize the strongly social, structural, systemic nature of what happens in wellbeing. So our field was virtually non-existent in terms of any research about teachers, full stop. Not even talk about well-being now, just teachers as people. Well-being now has rocketed, and we'll come to why that is in a minute and some of the problems with that. But there was a little bit of research, and in general education, the bulk of the research was about burnout and stress. But
Yes.
that's too late. And the notion of well-being is preventative steps and action.
Right.
That means you don't wait till burnout kicks in, that you're trying to create a state of being well, so that burnout doesn't happen. There's no, there are lots of things that contribute to burnout, and it's an extremely complex phenomena. But it's about the notion of the well-being approach was that to look in preventative terms. Now, you cannot for a moment research well-being, I think, unless you're extremely naive, and come away from this believing it's a psychological phenomenon. It's impossible.
Right.
And then you understand that it is psychological and structural. It isn't that you have no agency. So these views that see well-being as only being about structure are also not realistic. And the problems that I have is, if a teacher group asks me to go and talk to them about well-being, it's very difficult for me to go and not talk about personal agency and things they can do, because they don't want me to go and just tell them how shit their institution is. They probably know that.
Yeah.
So they want me to go and talk. So I've always found this a very big tension, and I have never, I don't believe, although, like anybody else, my own understandings have grown over time. So I don't know, at what point I may have, but to the best of my knowledge, I have always advocated that this is something that has to be addressed structurally. But that, of course, for an individual picking a book up, is a lot harder to engage with than something that's going to help them in their that they've got personal agency over. So I think it's about, you cannot deny the structural systemic problems, and that is something that needs to be addressed. But not every teacher is going to feel empowered or able to engage in that kind of advocacy or political work.
Yeah.
But what you hope is that if we have empowered teachers with some kind of voice and awareness about this topic, if we advocate for it, if we make it something that people discuss about, we make it easier to have those conversations. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
And that we have those conversations on a serious level with leadership and policymakers and institutions. And that, yes, you want to empower teachers in the moment. Now, I don't think I have ever given the impression that just some self-care strategies or coping strategies for stress is going to be the solution, ever. Because it's very clear the minute that you start to research this, that cannot be the solution to people's well-being problems. Because problems are caused by policy and structural and systemic problems. So I think this comes back to a lot of things. This comes back to the problem of the word well-being. And the whole notion of this. And we're into positive psychology. We might come to that in a minute. There's this simplistic views of what well-being is, the fact that it has a heritage in psychology, which is very typically individually focused and less social in its orientation, and the fact that there is a tension between agency and structure when we talk about well-being, and that is a real tension that has to be confronted in every conversation. And every teacher group that I go to work with want me to say something that's going to help them in the here and now. Yeah. And do I just say, no, this is, and I find that difficult. I do. I find that difficult. I find it difficult to say I have to have a conversation with them about understanding that this is not their sole responsibility, and they must never walk away from a webinar or a session with me thinking that this is just on them, ever. Yeah. But also I want to give people some strategies to help empower them, to feel that, to give them some sense of agency that maybe that will help them feel they have the resources to come together with others and maybe advocate and maybe come together as a group and maybe be able to voice this. And also a big part of talking about well-being is overcoming some of the taboos we have about burnout and mental health, about coming over, making a space and allowing people to talk about this comfortably and recognizing that this is a thing. It's not some happyology shit. And I'm sick of having to battle the simplistic, dismissive views because it's a popular topic and a popularistic word. And I do think it's associated with women, and I do think it's something that is discriminated 100%. Against in a sense by certain people because it's a female carey-sherry thing. Well, you know what? Do a bit more reading, guys. If that's how you think well-being is, this is a huge issue, and I feel very strongly, and you see how many teachers are struggling. And one of the things that became very clear with the pandemic, and it worked in a good and bad way. One of the great things about the pandemic, don't hear that in one sentence very often, do you? One of the pluses of the pandemic maybe was that we did start to talk about well-being, and that we realized it was a thing, and that it did need talking about. So it was a huge benefit for the field of the scholarship, and it has led to a rocketing interest. I mean, just unbelievable. We were talking about it in 2016, where we were like literally the only people talking about it, and everybody thought we were fringe and weird as well. And now it's like a huge topic. But there is always going to be the danger that some people will take very simplistic views to that. You have no control over how people are going to work with that. That's how it is. There are always people who are going to take different views to that. And another concern is that this doesn't become something that is only associated with the pandemic. Mm-hmm. We started researching it with grants in 2016 because it was a problem way before the pandemic, and it will continue to be an issue ongoing. So my concern is we don't dismiss it as, oh, pandemic's done now. Well, well-being's finished as a topic. Let's move on. I think that's a concern I have.
I think there are a lot of things to unpack here, but one of the things I was going to say, I think dealing with burnout, understanding a little bit more about teacher well-being, as you said, it's definitely a topic that is often led by female researchers or teachers in ELT. I remember the 2 sessions that I attended that talked about well-being were led by female. And I think the reason why, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that men suffer in silence. We have a hard time just externalizing, verbalizing our feelings. Even for me, when I dealt with burnout for the first time, I honestly just kept telling myself, I'm like, you're just being weak, come on, you can do more than that, Leo. I was kind of like putting myself down. And then eventually I picked up your book. I read more about it. And I really like how you propose more of and I think very much in line with complexity theory, you propose an ecological perspective to understanding well-being. And as you said, you're not just looking at well-being as like, let's just be positive and things are going to get better. But no, you're looking at also the strategies that could help those people immediately who are dealing with the problem. But as you said right now, and I'm glad that you did that, is you kind of like explain this better for people who don't have this understanding of, myself included back in the day, but I've changed, that well-being is a lot more than just kumbaya techniques or doing some yoga, wine and dine, that type of thing. I think that kind of addresses one of the questions that we had from one of our guests, well, not previous guests, but someone on social media, who basically, perhaps maybe they have also a very basic understanding of that, because we know that one of the things that is really affecting teacher well-being is the fact that there's a lot of precarity in English language teaching. Many teachers face low wages, job insecurity. A lot of them lack social benefits. And we know that language teachers, especially in private language institutions, are all part of this global educational precarious movement. So in the book, you talk about this need for systemic changes, but you also focus on the individual self-help techniques as well. So
I think I should also stress it.
Yeah.
Remember, this book is in a teacher handbook series.
Yes.
It's meant to be for teachers to go away and look at themselves and feel empowered by it. That's the whole aim of the series. So that's a different thing to academic books that I have written on the topic, which have a slightly different agenda.
Yes.
So I don't think anywhere that we've ever tried to oversimplify it, but the particular book, the Teacher Wellbeing book in the Oxford Handbook series, is a book that's meant to empower teachers as a handbook for practical intervention. So it has a different audience and a different agenda and a different purpose in that series than something that is trying to be an academic treatise on the subject with a completely different type of publication, of which we also have a couple that would be available for those interested. So yeah, I think one of the things that you touch on that is important, and you talk about it in relationship to men being able to talk about this comfortably and having space to talk about it and feeling validated in having that experience. And I think that is a big part of this kind of advocacy work that needs to happen, is not trying to smother this and dismiss it as something. It is absolutely central for our ability to teach well.
Yeah.
And if we want to be the best version of ourselves in the classroom, we have to be able to have high well-being. And it shouldn't be seen as a luxury or an addition or as a kind of, okay, if you want to do that on the side. It's the basic. And if we can get policy leaders and leadership to understand just how important this is to quality teaching, maybe they'll sit up. I mean, to be fair, teachers have the right to high well-being without any reference to learners. Just as a basic right. But if we want to talk about the effect on learners, learners learn better when they have high well-being. And if teachers have high well-being, learners are more likely to have well-being through processes of contagion. That's a clear no-brainer. So if we want quality teaching, we need to be taking care of the teachers. And that's just so fundamental and basic. And yet it is still widely not understood or accepted in practice and in policy. And that if we want the best teaching you're going to get, you've got to start with looking after your teachers. And you start with them. You don't start with your learners. You start with your teachers. And you look after them first and foremost. And then you will start getting benefits for your learners.
So let's say, I think the question then would be, how can a teacher who is perhaps invested in this idea of teacher well-being, who wants to talk to management, maybe the institution, about teacher well-being, what would you say is perhaps the best way to do that? Is by having a conversation with management? Is by forming a union? I don't know. I really don't know, because I've never had this conversation with any institutions. Whenever I dealt with burnout, I just took time off. I just said, like, I need some time off. I'm not feeling great. I knew it was burnout. Now I know, and I'm able to detect when burnout is coming closer, so I can take a break and be like, okay, it's coming. I don't have to push myself anymore, because I can feel it. I can see it right around the corner. It's like, hey, Leo, old friend, we can see you. But I don't know. I don't know what to do. And I don't know what a teacher who is dealing with these issues, who is dealing with low self-esteem, who is dealing with job insecurity, is not feeling mentally fit to be in the classroom. How can they initiate this conversation with institutions, with universities, with policymakers, and so forth?
I mean, there's so much that's difficult about this, because it does depend on the receptiveness of your institution.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on your leadership. It depends on how open they are to these kinds of conversations. It depends on the precarity of your job.
Yeah.
If you're in a very precarious job, you're not going to risk this kind of conversation, possibly.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think that there's so much about that it's impossible to give any generic advice, because every person will be in a very different setting, and that's part of understanding that it's very socially situated. I'm very in favour of unionism. I do think that we need trade unions. I do think that we need to have representation. I do think that there is a need for that across the field and also in the sector. I've argued very strongly that people who work freelance are often invisible in our community. They don't have union representatives. They don't appear in statistics, that they need caring for. They're part of our community. So those of us who are working in institutions do need to see that these people are part of our world. They're part of our community, part of our ecology, and they need some kind of looking after. And we have got the IATEFL Workers Union. We have got union representation. We have got people working for those kinds of situations. Within different countries and different institutions, there'll be different opportunities. I think I would strongly suggest finding other people. Find people you can talk to about this, whether it's locally, whether it's maybe in online communities and discussion groups, but not feeling alone with this. If you do feel that there is a risk of burnout, don't be afraid to go and seek professional help for this. Go and seek support. You need people. This isn't something that you have to battle with alone. And that's why these conversations about teacher wellbeing for me are so important, because it's about giving it space and acknowledging that this is part of life. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we can do to prevent this being a problem for people. Let's talk about what kind of support people need. Let's talk about how we can make this something that is addressed in institutions and at policy. And I wish there were easy solutions. If there were, I wouldn't be struggling with the tensions that I struggle with. But I think every individual, every institution, every set of leadership, the more that we can talk about this, the more we have conversations, the more people get together and talk with other people about it, the more they bring publications that they've read on it into their reading groups, or they bring it into their staff room, the more that we, have these conversations, the more, don't know what the word is in English, I can think of a German word now, the more we normalize it as part of our professional lives. And that once we normalize it as a key determinant of our professional lives and our success of our professional lives, then we can start talking about and try and make leadership and policy serious about taking on board what this means. But if leadership are allowed off the hook, and if policy is allowed not to address it and not to engage with it, and if we have people who keep making it fringe by making it seem like it's something hippie and kumbaya and go and sit around a campfire, we're going to be going around in circles. Yeah. So they're doing more harm than good. So I fully agree that we need to have serious conversations about it, but that needs serious research, it needs serious empirical measures, it needs people engaging with the structural and the psychological facets of it, and we need to be able to advocate, but also to make this a conversation people feel comfortable having, and that we normalize this as part of what it means to be a professional.
Especially men. I think men don't talk about those things. I feel like that's... I don't know if you know anyone who specializes in how male or female researchers, teachers behave, but I think that would be someone that I would love to have on the show, because whenever I talked about teacher well-being with male friends who are also teachers, the reception is always like, they roll their eyes. They're like, come on, Leo. I'm like, no, seriously. I dealt with burnout, and people don't seem to understand that. But whenever you go to a session, and I've been to a few conferences since COVID, and every time I see a person talking about well-being, it's always a female. So we don't have a male talking about that. So maybe that's something else that we need to add to the conversation, is why men don't talk about these problems, these issues that they're going
So
through.
in the UK, there was someone, and I hope he doesn't mind me giving him a shout out. And there's a guy called Phil Longwell who was at IATEFL,
Oh, I think I
and
know who he is. Yeah.
he has been brilliant in speaking very openly about well-being and about mental health issues and about how that is as an educator. So I think there are individuals, but they are rare and they are special. And Phil has done a huge amount of advocacy work and been brilliant. But I think, Leo, you're probably right in that there is a certain dismissiveness. I think as a, I don't know if you've ever read the book The Authority Gap. You might not have done,
No,
because
no, but
this is a book that women read, because The Authority Gap is written by Mary Seacott. It's a brilliant book about, basically, the short version of it is that men are taken more seriously and afforded more authority, particularly in academia, than women are.
Huh.
So, and I don't think that will strike anybody as a huge surprise, really. But that book's quite interesting to read, also in the way that people interact with female academics versus how they interact with male academics. And then, from my position, some topics are seen as female. And they're female topics, and well-being and social emotional competences, compassion, and so on. These are seen as, and so they are easily dismissed. Look,
Exactly.
the whole field of emotion research has been dismissed for such a long time because it wasn't logic or rational or cognition, which was given a kind of superior status, and all of that. And so that also plays into some of the resistance that can, or the dismissiveness. I think it's probably dismissiveness, not even active resistance, just the dismissiveness of
definitely.
topics and the kind of research sometimes.
Yeah.
Looking at it from the other perspective, you said that institutions and leadership there don't understand or misunderstand. I forget exactly what you said. The importance of it.
Yeah.
What specifically do they not understand? And if they did, because the proposal always is in this discussion, teachers need to, and it's always a kind of a provocative stand up for yourself, which it's not wrong, but if it was more collaborative, the solution's a lot easier, right?
I agree.
So
I agree.
what do institutions, in your opinion, need to understand better in order to get there?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's also really I don't mean that every institution is rubbish at supporting staff wellbeing, so I should perhaps take that back, as I've been making huge sweeping statements at the end of a long day. So apologies if I have. I don't mean to dismiss all institutions in that way, but I think many institutions, and also, like I just said, look at the field of research. We have focused very strongly on learners, and we have not paid as much attention to teachers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of them to do with learner-centeredness, but also if you look at SLA was always about the acquisition of the language through the learner, and the teacher, if at all, was just a background variable. It wasn't even, certainly wasn't looked at as a stakeholder, as a focus, as a person in their own right, as someone worthy of study. And I think that has sort of fed through into the whole of education. And the educational policy is very much about what we can do for learners, what learners need, how we can support learners. If you go to teacher professional development, it's always about what the teacher can do for the learner. Everything is about the learner. Now, I'm not saying that is always wrong, and it is clear that we are an other-oriented profession, that teaching is about the learners. But, and this is what we need them to understand, if you don't start by looking after your teachers first and care for them as individuals, understand what they need, what support, what are they struggling with, is the workload and what you expect of them reasonable, is it realistic, is it sustainable, and. If the leadership, if policymakers don't begin with understanding and caring for the teachers, everything else will be secondary.
Yeah.
And the whole of education is designed around focusing on the learner first and the teacher as a medium to support the learner.
Good.
Now, I get that. I understand why it is. And I'm not even saying that focusing on the learner is a wrong thing. It shouldn't be an either or. But if we don't, for me, obviously, if we don't begin by understanding teachers and their needs and the kind of support that they require to do their jobs well, which in every other job isn't really that big a surprise. But if we don't understand what teachers need to do their job well, what kind of support that they require, what kind of things are making their job difficult, what kind of challenges are they facing, and how can we alleviate some of that? If we don't begin with that, then we are not creating the best work conditions in which learning can happen and which learning and learners can benefit. And I don't think that that pathway of connection is clear for many institutions and leadership. I think the focus is so clearly on learners and what learners need. Even if you look at professional development, and I've ranted in many contexts about this, professional development is always, what can the teacher do for the learner?
Yeah.
Well, can't we talk about professional development in terms of what do teachers want? What do they need? What their
How can you do their
requirements
job
are?
better? Yeah, exactly.
So, so I think everything is oriented primarily around the learner needs, the learner outcomes, learning gains, the learner as a person, learner-centeredness, and the teacher is at best considered a medium through which that learning and the learning care takes place. And like I say, these things shouldn't be in competition, but it seems to me like we're addressing one side of the equation and virtually ignoring the other side.
Yeah.
And that strikes me as a gross imbalance in not only research, but very much in practice too.
Of a conversation I had with probably the only institution that I worked for that actually cared about the teacher, and the manager said something to me at one point when we were talking about, the needs of the teachers and all that, and he said to me, "Leo, I understand one thing. If the teacher is happy, the students are going to be happy. And if the students are happy, then everyone is happy. So make the teacher happy, pay them well, give them opportunities to grow, to develop, to have a say in the matter, and then the students are going to be fine because that teacher is happy. A happy teacher will engage, will connect, will build some nice rapport with the students, and then everything else flows." I think that's a good place for us to punctuate our conversation. It doesn't mean we're going to end here, because we might have you back, because I heard some updates in your life, and I know you're going to be you're working on some new projects. Anything you can share with us?
So if we're going to talk about controversial topics, I have a book coming out in the autumn. I'm on the final third proof stage. It has been a long and painful birth, all down to my fault. But I started this in 2019, and then there was the pandemic years. I don't even need to talk about the COVID years, and just other stuff in my life that meant it got a bit delayed. And it's a book entitled Compassion-Based Language Education. And the book is divided into two sections. The first half of the book is about teaching with compassion. So very much about rapport building, group dynamics, the relationships we build in the classroom with learners and among learners. And the second half of the book is about teaching for compassion. So the ways in which we can teach learners to become tolerant and open and respectful of diversity, talking about issues of things like global citizenship, talking about eco-literacy, about those kind of caring. Before there are people who are going to be reluctant to engage with the term compassion, but I chose it very deliberately because I want it to be about shared humanity. Now, the model of the book is based around the 3 C's. C's seem to be popular in education, don't they? So obviously I'm just going with the flow. So it's compassion, criticality, and courage. And my fundamental premise is that compassion is a kind of shared human characteristic that I think we can foster wherever we are, whoever we are, and will lead to better teaching in the present and hopefully more compassionate students and citizens in the future. And I'm not afraid for that to be accused of being idealistic. I can live with that critique. But I also added in the model criticality, that we do need some social criticality in all the things we talked about today about discussing structure, social inequalities, privilege, and so on. That is part of that discussion as well. And then the courage to be compassionate when it may not always be easy. And compassion has 2 sides. There's the thing that we traditionally understand by compassion, and then there's what we call fierce compassion, when you need to be assertive and you
Right.
need to advocate and so on. So I don't know how that book will be received. I have to admit I'm quite invested in it, so I feel a little bit fragile about it, I have to admit. But I'm kind of excited that after all this time, it's going to finally see the light of day.
Yes, I wrote it down. Compassion-based language education. When is the book coming out? You said in the fall?
It should be in the autumn, yeah. So
Okay.
I'm on the fight. I've got version 3 of the proofs at the moment. So I'm gradually getting to the stage where I never want to see it again.
So we'll definitely have to have you back on the show so you can come and talk
And if
more
you're
about
listening
the
to
book.
this right now, it's probably the fall, so it's out now. Go get it. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Exactly. Thanks for us into the future, Andrew. Andrew, we
you.
have our last
Yes.
what do you call it? Our tradition.
I was going to say gimmick, but it's tradition. Tradition's better.
Tradition is better. Gimmick is
So we do a thing at the end where when we interview, we ask them a question to leave for the next guest. They don't know who they are or what their context is. And we have a question that was left for you. It's actually, I think, a really good one for what we've talked about. You've probably answered it a little bit. Maybe you can take it in a different direction if you wish. The question is a simple one. What change do you want to initiate in language education with your research?
Oh yeah, I just would like to put more humanity back into to language teaching, in practice, in how we engage with each other. I would just like humanity to take center stage, and maybe that's also part of why I chose the term compassion and not something else. Is that people will always come at this with their own agenda and their own way of doing it. I don't think these things are in competition. People will do things differently and then do it in their own way. But I think we can all sort of go from a shared basis of humanity. And I think that's what I would like to achieve in my classes, in my teaching, but also in my research, that we put the kindness and the humanity back center stage.
Amazing.
sweet.
Love it.
In the second part, Andrew?
And now your turn, Sarah. So we will be interviewing the next person, and a question that you would like to leave. You don't know who they are, something that you're interested in, or whatever you want. We will ask the next person.
Okay, what would you like language teaching classrooms 10 years from now to look like? What would you like if we talked about reverse engineering? So one of the things I probably shouldn't say this because I'm going to give away my answer to it, right? I'll shut up. I'll talk to you this. When we stop recording, I'll tell you what I was going to say, so I'll shut up. But yeah, what would they like classrooms 10 years from now to look like?
If that's not a teaser to listen to our next interview with you, I don't know what is. That's very good. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks
Thank
for
you
being
so
on the
much.
show. Thanks for your time. Thanks everyone for listening.